So, looking back a bit, indigenous traditions make up a diverse group, one that includes the traditions and practices of generally small-scale tribal communities from all over the world. These tribal communities tend to associate their spirituality very closely with the earth, with the land on which they live, with the community itself as a cohesive group, and with oral and embodied modes of knowing. While the rituals and specific cultural forms vary from community to community, indigenous traditions tend to offer to the modern world, a vision of reality that is more interconnected, physically and spiritually, than the reality generally assumed by post-Enlightenment communities of the so-called West. For this reason, and for others, modern communities and contemporary spiritual practitioners have often found that indigenous traditions offer a wealth of knowledge and resources that can imbue their own lives with a greater sense of meaning and a more localized sense of value. Now, in the 21st century American context, we've seen an increasing awareness of the potentially harmful, exploitative effects of what's most often referred to as cultural appropriation. There's a pretty vibrant debate around questions of what counts as appropriation and what counts as appreciation. And there's no real consensus as to where a line might be drawn. Partly, people disagree on this sort of thing, but partly the ground keeps shifting. But closer to the appropriation end, we might find the monetizing of cultural and religious artifacts in the interest of power or status, even style, by someone from outside of the culture being monetized. Closer to the appreciation end, we might find attendance at classes, workshops, or retreats in the interest of developing fluency with another culture's religious or spiritual practices to enrich the lives of oneself and one's community. We can find examples of both, and many besides, in 20th and 21st century responses to and engagements with indigenous traditions. One of the characteristics that tends to unite these contemporary practitioners, one of the things about indigenous traditions that these contemporary folks tend to be drawn towards, is an emphasis on healing and positivity, a sense that the future is not altogether bleak, and that we as individuals, enmeshed within an expansive community, can have a genuinely positive impact on the course that this spaceship Earth will chart into the future. When we talk about new religious movements, NRMs for short, what we're talking about are groups of adherents, people who adhere or stick to one or another faith and practice community that have developed since the late 19th century. Over the past 2 centuries or so, there's been a great flourishing of creative as well as defensive responses to industrialism, consumer capitalism, global pluralism, and other conditions of modernity. A whole lot of new religious groups have sprung up. Often, they draw on the traditions of the past, indigenous traditions, institutional traditions, classical traditions, and they see themselves as rooted in those ancient traditions. One loosely coherent group that follows this pattern and that has gained cultural currency pretty steadily over the past century or so are the neo-pagans. That means new pagan, and pagan comes from the Latin paganus, meaning of the country or rural. Because during the late medieval institutional expansion and power concentration of both Christianity and Islam, rural communities weren't as accessible as city centers. These communities were missionized and converted at far lower rates. So the word came to mean in usage a person who was not Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. A pagan, somebody out in the country, unchurched, a nature worshiper, vaguely. Sometimes thought of in demonic terms and often persecuted throughout history, pagan and neo-pagan traditions tend to be pantheistic, everything's God or sacred, polytheistic, there are many deities, and animistic, all material is animated or inspirited, alive with sacred potential. And though there is no unbroken written transmission of teachings, and though oral transmission was largely stymied through mass oppression and murder, neo-pagans often see their own practices as directly linked to those of older pagan traditions. Neo-pagan communities are very decentralized, and really they center the relationship between humans and the natural world. The New Age is an overlapping category that's a little bit different. Really coming on stage in the countercultural era of the 60s and 70s, it gets its name from the age of Aquarius, which, if you count the stars just so, we may have entered, or just about then, Again, really decentralized, maybe most coherent in metaphysical bookstores where you can find things like rocks and gems, tarot cards, and books on transformational practices. It's bound up with cultural movements of the mid-century like feminism, environmentalism, sexual liberation. The New Age really focuses more on that healing or transformational aspect rather than centering the human-nature relationship. Lastly, atheism. Recall that Prothero talks about atheism and agnosticism and about how we functionally recognize the difference between the two. One point to consider here is the question of fundamentalism. And this fundamentalism, which appears in each and every religious tradition we'll encounter to a greater or lesser degree, even though in contemporary America we might most closely associate fundamentalism with Christianity and Islam, this fundamentalism also appears in the context of atheism, in terms of what Prothero refers to as the angry atheist, that point of view. According to this, I'll call it the fundamentalist atheist model. According to this model, the scientific worldview is altogether objective, and more so, the values that the scientific worldview stands on, without being able to prove, because as values, such things just aren't in the realm of proof, those values are championed as themselves objective, pressing, and irrefutable. So that, sensory input is the only proof of truth, and reproducibility is the measure of that truth. Now, we know that this is not true all the time for many religious or spiritual perspectives, or if it is true, it's true of one mode of living and knowing, an important one, yes, but not all modes of knowing or living. But if one takes scientific materialism to be a complete vision, a complete set of values, then the cosmos that it constructs is one with no God, no overarching spiritual or metaphysical sense of meaning. Objective, observable fact is everything. The staunch or fundamentalist atheists, they might be right, Scientific materialism might present the whole truth, but the system they propose is a depletion of what Tillich, remember, referred to as the depth dimension. The moral horizon here is built on what? It's on, maybe curiosity and knowledge, the self-preservation of the species, progress of a generally technological sort, mercantile goods with an eye to futurity maybe in terms of legacy, or maybe just pleasure. The shared moral horizon that this worldview envisions can be made up of one or more than one of these things, or others, and again, maybe this is right. Maybe this picture of reality is the true one. Scientific materialism is definitely a really powerful tool for accessing the truths of our physical reality. Whether or not it paints a complete picture of our total reality, the answer to that really comes down to the question of meaning and value and how you want to understand and manifest those things in your own life. So I'll close here today, and I'll close this first unit by referring to a couple thinkers who have addressed the question of atheism. Many of you may have heard of Pascal's wager, given to us by French philosopher Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662. He said, listen, should I be an atheist? Should I believe in God? Now, he lived in a context where that God was decidedly Christian, but we can extend it to a more global or cross-traditional sort of question. Well, he says, if I say there's no God and I'm right, no big deal. I die, that's it. If I say there's a God and I'm right, then lucky me, I have a chance at heaven. If I say there is a God and I'm wrong, no big deal, I die. But here's the kicker. If I say there's no God and I'm wrong, well, then that might just be a big deal, like eternity in the fiery pits of hell or sort of big deal. Again, he's working in a Christian context. So for Pascal, it's just a better gamble to say that there is a God. It's a long-term pragmatism, really, that decides his bet. But that's a little less than altogether encouraging, really, and it's missing something of the self-motivated authenticity of faith that we generally see running through religious traditions. Here's another thought on atheism, and one I'll leave you with today. Richard Robinson is a modern philosopher, 1902 to 1996, who wrote a book called An Atheist's Values. And I want to quote him to give a vision of atheism that is undergirded by a sense of value and meaning, and that doesn't rest on a strictly rational platform. He writes, "There is no person in this universe to love us except ourselves. Therefore, let us love one another. The human race is alone, but individual men need not be alone because we have each other. We are brothers without a father. Let us all the more for that behave brotherly to each other." And of course, he meant sisterly too. The finest achievement, he goes on to say, for humanity is to recognize our predicament, including our insecurity and our coming extinction, and to maintain our cheerfulness and love and decency in spite of it, to prosecute our ideals in spite of it. We have good things to contemplate and high things to do. Let us do them. So atheism can go a lot of different ways, as can any tradition. Our capacity as scholars to draw firm boundaries around religions, spiritualities, worldviews, that capacity is relatively low these days. A lot of things are changing very quickly in the world of religion. About a third of Americans report no religious affiliation. There's a great deal of spiritual but not religious going on. At the same time, fundamentalist forms of traditional faiths are gaining market share, and indigenous spiritual traditions around the world are in a time of reinvigoration. Things are changing. The possibility that religion will go away? I don't know. Even under the pressure of scientific materialism or sectarian violence? I don't see it. So let's move forward. Over the next 6 units, we'll cover one religion at a time, and we'll begin with Judaism.